Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and last week I made Catnap in his various versions, so I figured why not keep the creepy train rolling and make Dog Day hanging out in his prison. Of course, that means I need to make Dog Day, which means I need to make his body. However, the beauty of making Daniel Dog Day Lewis is that I only have to make his upper body, since, well, he doesn't really have a lower body. Instead, he's got a big old hole where his legs should be, which makes my job roughly 34% easier. Now, I'm not fully clued up on Poppy's Playtime lore, but when I looked up Catnap and Dog Day on Google, it seemed to be mostly fan art that made me slightly uncomfortable, so I'm just gonna have to assume that he's missing his bottom half as a result of some sort of horrible burrito-related accident. For my part though, once I'd rammed a rod up his bottom hole, I can add a thin strip of clay to his front, then using a tiny wire tool I can add a couple offset rows of hooks to make what might pass as a zipper before adding his belt. With that, Dog Day's torso's finished, so it's time to make his head. Fortunately, last week I had plenty of practice making a spooky cat head, and from what I can tell, a spooky dog head involves mostly the same steps. In fact, I even considered stripping the fur and purple paint off the other model and reusing the footage of me making Catnap's head to save myself some time and frustration, but decided that would be disingenuous, and I'm nothing if not fully ingenuous. Holy shit, it is a word. I could of course also be Frank, but then I'd have to change my name. So instead I'll start fresh and make a brand new face by cutting a sphere into a 3/4 sphere and adding some big old eye sockets. I then added some corner lips to the corners of the lips, carved out the mouth, and got to work refining the shape. Once I added the overly expressive eyebrows all dogs have, I fixed the upper lip and added the seam running from front to back. At some point I also added a nose, but I can't find the footage, so you'll just have to believe me. Then I can stick a rod into the bottom of the head and smoosh it onto a pre-sausaged neck nub before gently blending that into the rest of the head. I want the head to be removable for painting and furring later, so I'm not going to fix them in place yet. Otherwise, with the head fixed at a slightly sad, not quite alive, but not quite dead angle, it's time to make his ears. I'll start with a little blob of clay that I'll smoosh and pull and push and poke until I've got a single mirrored amalgamation of ears, at which point I can separate these conjoined twins, leaving me with two almost identical ears to fit onto Dog Day's head. I'll then return the head to the body so I can accurately angle the ears downwards, but after that though, it's time to make his arms. I've cut a couple lengths of armature wire to size so I can jam them into some pre-poked holes in his torso. I'll then tilt the wrists down for future hands before coating the wires in a thick-ish layer of clay. Once it's been smoothed out, that's pretty much the arms done, so I can get on to making his hands. As all good things in life do, his hands start as little balls that I can then smoosh and moosh into a shape into which I can cut a set of 3 little fingies before attaching a thumb and thickening up the wrist. I'll then do a little reshaping before fitting it onto my previously bent wrist bones, at which point I can start repositioning the fingers. And once I'm happy with the hook hands, I can then bake them both before barreling onwards to make the leather belts holding him aloft. But before I bake the belts, I'm gonna coat the arms in a layer of this water-based separator. Once this stuff is painted on and left to dry, it creates a barrier preventing subsequent layers of clay from adhering to the layer beneath, meaning I can easily remove whatever it is I've sculpted on top. In this case, I'm gonna make the leather belts that are wrapped around Dog Day's arms directly on top of the arms so that I can get the size and position correct, but I want to be able to remove the belts once they've been baked so that I can add the fur underneath. To that end, I've made a pair of belts on both arms and baked them in the oven as a whole. Then once they've had a chance to cool down, I can use a scalpel to cut them open to the back and safely slide them off the wrist. Of course, making them out of cause clay is also essential since the clay needs to be bendy, otherwise they'll just shatter into 1,000 pieces when I try and remove them. With the belts removed though, I can reassemble a fully sculpted Dog Day. Except for the legs, I guess, but again, that's kind of the point. Now before I encase Dog Day in a layer of fur, I want to paint his skin the correct color so any sections that show through won't be a sickly gray. I'll start by base coating the entire body in a layer of orange, which, due to it being sprayed over the gray clay, ends up being dark and desaturated, which is actually perfect. I'll then paint the inside of the mouth and eyes black before adding some bright yellow lip liner and painting the nose black. The belly of the body then gets painted that same lip liner yellow, and I can give the ears a couple coats of red before giving the gloves the exact same. Then it's on to enleathering all the belts, which I'll do by giving them an initial brown base coat followed by a heavy dark brown wash. I'll then work my way around the edges of the wider belts with a light brown, cutting lines and cracks into the surface to make the leather look distressed. For the smaller belts, I'll do the opposite of that by taking a much darker brown and stippling that haphazardly along the center of each belt, leaving the edge lighter. Finally, all the metallic bits get a metallic bit base coating, and I can paint the zipper on Dog Day's torso black. With that, my base coating is done, and I've got a flat, lifeless looking Dog Day in several pieces. Which means we're finally ready for some fur. Last week I used some extra fine 1mm purple fur to cover Catnap, but I wanted to try using a slightly longer grass this week to see if it makes the fur look a little less like velvet and a little bit more like fur. So I went ahead and bought myself some 3mm canary yellow static grass. Yellow is notoriously hard to paint, so I figured by starting with yellow I can paint the rest of the fur whatever color I need after. I'll sprinkle this over my magic electrostatic box, then coat the body in a thick layer of PVA glue, then it's just a case of switching the box on and watching the magic happen. The little box statically charges the grass so it flies up and sticks to Dog Day's head in such a way that only the tip sticks, creating a freshly electrocuted golden labradoodle. By gently combing the fur, I can get it to lay flat in the direction that I want before setting it aside to dry and coating the rest of the body parts in the exact same way. Once the glue's dried and the hairs are locked in place, I can start recoloring the fur and covering all the skin that's showing through beneath. I'll go over the majority of the body with that original orange I used, which is much more vibrant now that it's going over the yellow of the fur, and I'll give the ears the same red as well before adding a tiny bit of red to the left eye socket. I can then reassemble the body, fixing the pieces in place with glue. The various leather straps can then get reattached, and because you won't be able to see the back, I don't care if they don't connect on the other side. And I also made him a collar off camera. Finally, I can add the buckle to the belt that I forgot to add earlier, as well as the red and gold star that gets stuck to his zipper. With that, Dog Day is looking a little fluffier, but he's far too clean given where he chooses to hang out, so I'll dirty him up using my pastel dust. This is just pastel chalk that I smashed into dust with a hammer, so I can use a brush to brush them onto Dog Day's fur to make him look significantly less clean. Finally, I'll add a heavy red wash around the missing legs, since I'm assuming they were removed somewhat haphazardly, and the belt around his waist is less to keep his pants up and more to keep his insides in. However, with that lovely little detail added, Dog Day is all done day, which means it's time to set him aside so I can get to work making his prison. Dog Day's prison comes complete with colorful padded walls, which means I need to make a whole bunch of little sloped squares. Now, not trusting my shaky little hands to cut those long strips into squares, I'll break out the old hot wire cutting table so I can cut all the short ends at once, ensuring I've got relatively equally sized little squares. Now that I've got roughly 7 billion squares cut, I need to soften the edges so they're not all flat. To do this, I'll rub a large ball stylus back and forth along the edge, which should give me a pretty good looking little pillowy square. I can then repeat this for every other square until I've got the full set. I cut some more XPS foam to size so that I have 2 side walls and a big back wall, which will give me a nice flat surface upon which to attach my squares. I'll coat the wall in a nice thick layer of PVA glue, then get to sticking them down. I didn't count how many squares I cut, and I didn't actually measure how big the walls would be, since I was only concerned with making sure Dog Day fit inside without being too big or too small. Which is why it's a small miracle that I got all 3 walls completely covered with only a single square left to spare. It really goes to show you that planning ahead is just a waste of time. Otherwise, with the walls built, it's time to prime them. With the walls browned, I'll use my airbrush to paint each square white before picking squares at random to add a touch of color to. Then, once there were an adequate number of colored squares, I'll use a long fine liner brush and some opaque black ink to make sure all the cracks are completely blacked out before coming back with a lighter sweat-stained brown on a sponge to add an extra line of wear and tear around the edges. With that, my padded walls are finished and ready to be assembled. I made an appropriately sized concrete slab for the floor, and a little hot glue will attach all the pieces to one another. I'll then use a black sponge to sponge some black onto the back wall, as well as a brush to flick lots of spray all over the place. I don't know what this black is, but I do know it's an important part of Dog Days Prison. Finally, a little dirty brown wash around the base of the walls, and I can figure out where I'm gonna put Dog Day. To hang him, however, I'm going to be a little sneaky and drill a hole in his back so I can fit a wire into his spine and through the back of the box to support his weight. I'll then tuck the wire into the base of the box and hold it in place with some hot glue, and no one will ever know that it's not the leather straps that are holding Dog Day up, but a tiny armature wire. I made the roof similar to the walls, but as 3 big blocks instead, and this gets glued onto the top of the box, and I can finally add the straps. I made these off camera in the same way I made the belts on his arms, and to hang them from the ceiling, I made some armature wire hooks embedded in clay blocks. The belts can get looped onto the hooks, then the hooks can be attached to the ceiling with the belts hanging down to the corresponding arm straps, where I'll cut away the excess and glue the belt to the back of the arm. I can then repeat this for the rest of the straps, and by the end of it, it kinda looks like the straps are what's supporting Dog Day's body. I'll then add some concrete rubble that's strategically placed around Dog Day's open bottom hole, which will allow adorable little stuffed animals to crawl into his open cavity, taking control of him and running down the main. What is this game? Who thought this up? Now, I'm sure some among you probably thought I'd forgotten to add Dog Day stitches, but I want to assure you that's not the case. I just thought it'd be more fun to add them at the very end when it's nearly impossible to get the correct angles. As for the front, I actually made metal prison bars, but decided that they blocked too much of the view and made the whole thing look kind of awkward, so I decided not to use it. Finally, in lieu of making dozens of little stuffed animals waiting to possess our unfortunate hero, I made a little catnap who can hang out in the corner waiting his chance. Otherwise, I'd say that's us done here, and on to the glamour shots.
You're Pappy's angel, come to save us. Nothing left to save, not here.
As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them. Happy 10th birthday, Grant, Sassy Mama, Jamie Martin, Unfortunate Addict of Dating Sims, Magooin, Roof, Keely, Chloe Pointer, Jake and Elizabeth Love Tiny Nerdy Things, Mr. Goose, Jedi, Dashiel Cthulhu Squirrel, Chally Forever, Luke Ray, and you are the strategically placed belt that keeps this channel's insides inside. As always, do the thing and hit the other thing and all that stuff. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.